let's look at how the United States went from an isolationist policy to an imperialist nation. At first, when our nation is first formed under the Constitution, we look at things like George Washington's advice in his farewell address. We look at things like the fact that we have two oceans, one on each side of us, which provide natural, strong barriers. Later, when the British are allies, we look at things like the British Navy to think that really we don't need to concern ourselves with other parts of the world. And this is best embodied by the Monroe Doctrine. You keep out of the Western Hemisphere, we'll stay out of your business, Europe. Another reason for the lack of an outward imperial policy is after the Civil War, most Americans are really focused on domestic issues. For example, Reconstruction. Other issues like industrialization and urbanization are really occupying a lot of people's thoughts and concerns. All of these lead to the isolationist policy that was so common in the 1800s. In fact, some people even urged that the government get rid of the Foreign Service. That's the ambassadors in the State Department. One of their complaints with that, aside from them thinking it wasn't necessary, was that these were prime spots for the spoils system to reward somebody with a cushy job as the ambassador of England, or if they spoke French, the ambassador of France. However, this attitude is going to start to change. By the 1870s, there's more interest in what's going on beyond our borders. Some of that has to do with advancements in technology. The telegraph and eventually the telephone, combined with undersea cables like the transatlantic cable in 1858, means that Americans are better informed on what is going on outside of our borders. But early on, we simply wanted to expand, manifest destiny, rule over all of this continent, not colonize other parts of the world like Europe was doing. So how did we go to imperialism? Well, if you take a look at this map from 1890, you can probably notice that just about everything is settled. Everything says territory next to it. The 1890 census announced that the frontier was closed, which means that any further growth is going to have to take place beyond our continental borders. Another reason for the change is the increase in production that comes with the Industrial Revolution. Factories and farms need overseas markets to continue to sell the goods that they're producing. We need to start to export finished goods, and that's what we see here, the growth of finished goods or merchandise. We can see how it grows from 393 to 1.4 billion in 1900. An important year in U.S. history is 1898. That's the year we exported more than we imported for the first time, and that will last through the 1960s. Another reason for the change to imperialism is leadership, political leadership. One notable person who was never president, but Secretary of State James G. Blaine, secretary under Garfield and Harrison. He is in charge of our foreign policy, or at least helps the president with foreign policy. And Blaine really believes that foreign markets were essential to economic growth. So Blaine used tariff reciprocity. That's where we'll lower our tariff if you lower your tariff types of deals, to gain access to markets and for Americans to start to sell more goods in places like Latin America and Asia and Africa. Another reason for the change might be described as imperialism fever. You could say that the United States was caught up in the imperialism fever that was plaguing many European nations in the late 1800s. All those European nations are grabbing land as fast as they can, and we don't want to get into the game too late. We want to get what we can get. After all, maps like this were how great nations measured their strength in the early 1900s. This political cartoon demonstrates another reason for the change to imperialism, and that has to do with some of the thoughts of the time, some of the intellectual ideas of the time, the first being social Darwinism. We first talked about social Darwinism. We talked about maybe the rich and the poor during the Industrial Revolution. Some people are more fit than others. Social Darwinism applied on a global scale might say, or lead some people to believe, that some races are more fit than others. Here's another political cartoon from the era. And this nicely demonstrates what's known as biogenetic law. This idea that uncivilized races are like adolescents. They're like children, as we see here in the front row. They need supervision. They need protection. And it's the Anglo-Saxons' racial superiority that makes them ideal for providing that supervision and protection. This is very similar to the paternalism we talked about in the chapters about slavery. Literature at the time brings a lot of these ideas together, most notably Our Country by Josiah Strong. He calls on foreign missionary work to go civilize the world under the Anglo-Saxon races. He calls on expanding trade. After all, the desire for physical objects is a trademark of civilized people. We should go sell our stuff to other people in other parts of the world. He says we should spread Christianity. He also believes that's a trademark of civilization. And in his book, he really predicts the conquest of Mexico and Latin America and Africa. This change is a gradual change, so that by 1890, our nation needs and really wants a foreign policy different than isolation.